The next kingdom in domain Eukarya is Kingdom Plantae. First, state the unique characteristic of Plantae. All organisms in Kingdom Plantae are multicellular organisms and they are eukaryotic. Eukaryotic means that they have true nucleus, they have membrane-bound organelles, and their DNA is enclosed inside the nuclear membrane. Second, the cell wall is made up of cellulose. Kingdom Plantae are photoautotrophic. Maksudnya, the organism can conduct photosynthesis sebab dia ada chlorophyll. And the chlorophyll can be found inside an organelle known as chloroplast. The next characteristic of organism in Plantae is the food storage is in the form of starch. So the starch is produced as a product of photosynthesis. So that's why kita akan jumpa starch granules, which is vesicle that contain many starch inside the stroma of a chloroplast. So a few of the characteristic yang saya sudah mention kat sini, saya sudah describe dalam group algae. So there will be a few characteristics that the group algae will share with Kingdom Plantae. That's why kita kata group algae adalah plant-like organisms. Sebab a few of these characteristics yang ada dekat Plantae pun ada dekat group algae. Next, Plantae shows alternation of generation in their life cycle. So what does it mean by alternation of generation? So basically all organisms in group Plantae will have two separate generations with different number of chromosomes. So plant can have gametophyte generation, which is the haploid generation, and also sporophyte generation, which is the diploid generation. So maksudnya plant ni ada body dia yang 2N, diploid, yang kita panggil sebagai sporophyte generation. So the sporophyte will undergo meiosis to produce haploid spore. The spore will continue to develop into another haploid body, which is gametophyte generation. So in between the stage of sporophyte to form gametophyte, there is no fertilization needed. For example, so ni adalah fern ataupun pteridophyte. Next kita akan tengok in detail. So fern yang kita nampak dekat hutan tu adalah sporophyte generation. So every parts of this plant is sporophyte, which is 2N. So the sporophyte will produce spores inside a cluster of sporangium known as sori ataupun sorus. Dalam sorus ini akan ada sporangium that will produce spore by meiosis. So when the spores are mature, the spores will develop to form a structure known as protellus. So kat sini kita nampak protellus is N, which is haploid. So spore yang N tadi akan develop to form a mature protellus. So protellus is the gametophyte generation untuk fern. Next, the protellus will undergo mitosis to form sperm or egg. Baru dia akan form gametes, sebab tu nama dia gametophyte, structure that will produce gametes. Kalau sporophyte tadi sporo, to produce spore. So daripada 2N to produce spore yang N, so meiosis lah. So untuk protellus, gametophyte is already N. So to produce sperm or egg, that is also N, so it will undergo mitosis. So gametophyte will produce gametes, sporophyte will produce spore. When the sperm and the egg undergo fertilization, then it will produce sporophyte generation. So in this case kita nampak sporophyte itu tumbuh daripada gametophyte. So selepas sporophyte itu grow up, then it will form the fern, paku pakis yang kita biasa nampak tersebut, sporophyte generation 2N. So this is the alternation of generation of organisms in Kingdom Plantae. That was the characteristic of organisms in Kingdom Plantae. Next, kita akan tengok classification of Plantae into 4 groups. So, sebelum ni dalam Kingdom Protista pun kita dah jumpa perkataan groups. So, ingat groups is another taxa in hierarchical classification in taxonomy that sit between kingdom and phylum. So, dia tengah-tengah. So, in Kingdom Plantae, after kingdom bukan terus phylum. After kingdom, kita divide dulu organism in Plantae into 4 groups. So what are the 4 groups of organism in Kingdom Plantae? So the first one is group Bryophytes, for example Polytrichum. Next is Pteridophyte, which is Bryopteris. Third, Gymnosperms, Pinus species. And then the fourth one, Angiosperms, Hibiscus rosa sinensis. So for each of these groups, awak kena boleh state an example. So macam mana organisms in Plantae divided into 4 groups? So first, kita akan divide organisms in terms of sama ada dia ada ke tak ada vascular tissue. So Bryophytes are Plantae that does not have vascular tissue. Maksudnya tak ada xylem dan juga tak ada phloem. So the other 3 groups mesti ada vascular tissue. Next, to differentiate between Pteridophytes and Gymnosperms, kita tengok sama ada organism tu boleh produce seed ke tak boleh produce seed. So Pteridophytes are vascular plant that does not produce seed. Dia hanya produce spore sahaja. So itu Pteridophytes. Next, bila ada seed, kita kena differentiate sama ada the seed is produced inside a flower or is not produced inside a flower. So for Gymnosperm, they can produce seed but not inside flower. Instead, the seed will produce inside a reproductive structure known as cones. And lastly, Angiosperms, so ni yang kita biasa tengok, which is flowering plants. So all angiosperms can produce flower and the flower will contain ovule that will develop into seed. State unique characteristic of Bryophytes, which is Polytrichum sp. So kat sini awak nampak, instead of saya type Polytrichum itu sengit, saya gariskan. So whenever you write down a scientific name, awak tak boleh italickan. Awak kena underline the genus and the species. All Bryophytes are seedless plant, means that they cannot produce seed, as well as they are non-vascular plants, means that they does not have xylem or phloem tissue. So since Bryophytes is non-vascular, that's why another related characteristic for Bryophytes is they do not have true roots, stems and leaves. Tetapi kalau tengok gambar untuk Bryophytes, awak akan nampak structure yang macam roots, macam stem or macam leaves. Tapi we cannot call them root, stem or leaf just because dia tak ada xylem or phloem. So in terms of no true roots, Bryophytes have rhizoid. Rhizoid tu macam a replacement for roots. So function rhizoid dengan roots adalah lebih kurang sama, iaitu to anchor the plant to surface as well as to absorb water and minerals. So since Bryophytes does not have vascular tissue, that's why in terms of habitat, Bryophytes can be found in damp or moist environment. For example, on land, near stream, river and on forest floor. So Bryophytes ni basically lumut. So kalau kita biasa tengok lumut dekat tepi longkang, dekat batu yang berair, dekat tepi sungai. Okay? Sebab apa? Sebab Bryophytes tak ada vascular tissue. So dia memang dependent on area yang ada banyak lembapan ataupun ada banyak water supaya dia senang untuk dapat air. Tapi jangan anggap Bryophytes ni aquatic. Bukan. They are still terrestrial plant. Plant yang hidup dekat atas terrestrial environment, dekat tanah. Bukan di dalam air macam green algae. So kat sini kita nampak The body of the bryophytes, dia ada structure yang macam stem, ada structure yang macam leaves, ada structure yang macam roots. Tapi kita cannot consider this as true root, stem and leaves just because all this structure does not contain xylem or phloem tissue. So the next character is in terms of reproduction. So all organisms in bryophytes need water for fertilization. Why? The reason for that is the flagellated sperm cell must swim through a film of water to reach the egg cell and undergo fertilization to form embryo. So the gametophyte of polytrichum, ada male gametophyte, ada female gametophyte. So the gametophyte akan ada specific structure. Dekat male yang kita panggil sebagai enteridium. So dekat female pula akan ada specific structure yang kita panggil sebagai archegonium. So dekat enteridium, archegonium ni lah kita akan jumpa the gametes, which is sperm ataupun egg. So enteridium will produce sperm by mitosis, archegonium will produce egg pun by mitosis. So for the sperm to swim towards the egg, it needs water. So another reason kenapa habitat tadi mesti damp ataupun mesti watery, sebab the male gametes, which is the sperm, needs the water for it to swim towards the egg. So kalau tak ada air, sperm tu tak boleh nak swim. Kenapa saya kata swim? Sebab sperm in bryophytes adalah flagellated. So dia memang akan berenang menggunakan dia punya flagella towards the egg. So fertilization will form zygote and the zygote will develop into embryo. Embryo pula akan form the next generation, which is the sporophyte generation, iaitu diploid. The next characteristic for organisms in group Bryophytes is the gametophyte generation, which is the haploid generation, is the dominant generation. So kat sini ada satu perkataan iaitu dominant generation. So the term dominant generation refers to the size and refers to the lifespan of the generation. So ni kita compare siapa punya size lebih besar, siapa punya lifespan lagi panjang. So in Bryophytes, gametophyte iaitu the haploid generation is the dominant generation over the sporophyte generation. Maksudnya gametophyte itu saiz lebih besar dan lifespan lebih panjang compared to the sporophyte. Next, sporophyte generation is dependent on the gametophyte generation for water and nutrients. Maksudnya, sporophyte yang diploid tadi, dia tak boleh hidup kalau tak ada gametophyte. Sebab kalau tengok dalam gambar ni pun, the gametophyte generation yang ada structure yang macam leaves, the leaf-like structure. So maksudnya gametophyte yang boleh buat photosynthesis dan boleh absorb water and nutrient. The sporophyte generation, dia tak ada dua structure tersebut. That's why kita nampak sporophyte generation akan remain attached dekat dia punya gametophyte. Kenapa dia attach ke gametophyte? Sebab dia akan absorb nutrient dan juga absorb product of photosynthesis daripada dia punya gametophyte generation. So that's why ada point nombor 7 dengan nombor 8 tersebut. Okay, next kita juga nampak a few structure that belongs to the sporophyte generation. Iaitu akan ada foot. Foot tu basically nak kata attachment site between the sporophyte and the gametophyte. Next, ada long stalk, ada batang yang panjang kita panggil sebagai seta. And then dekat hujung seta tu ada structure called capsule. So capsule that contains sporangium that will undergo meiosis to produce haploid spore. So sporophyte produce spore di dalam capsule untuk bryophytes. The next group is pteridophytes. So similar to bryophytes, pteridophytes are also seedless plants. But tak sama dengan bryophytes, pteridophytes ada well-developed vascular tissue. Maksudnya, pteridophytes ada xylem and phloem. Cuma, xylem and phloem in pteridophytes is considered as simple. since pteridophytes already have vascular tissue, so we can say that they have true roots, stems, and leaves. And the leaves is also known as frond. All pteridophytes have cuticles to prevent water loss. So dekat surface of the plant akan ada satu layer yang kita panggil sebagai cuticle. And cuticle ni basically waxy, iaitu bersifat hydrophobic to prevent water loss directly from the surface of the plants. Pteridophytes also has stomata in the leaves that will allow gaseous exchange. So bila ada gaseous exchange, akan ada juga proses transpiration. So as long as plant tersebut ada xylem, usually dia akan ada stoma. And then the stoma will allow transpiration. So transpiration is very important to initiate movement of water inside the xylem tissue from roots to shoot. Okay, because of pteridophytes having vascular tissue, that's why in terms of size, kita boleh nampak pteridophyte ataupun paku pakis fern is generally larger in size and taller compared to Bryophytes. Next, the habitat is very similar to Bryophytes, iaitu damp and moist area, still on land, near stream, rivers and on forest floor. Cuma, when we compare the habitats of Pteridophyte dengan Bryophytes in terms of geographical area dia lebih widespread, lebih besar area dia compared to Bryophytes. Number 9, reproduction. Similar to Bryophytes, Pteridophytes also need water for fertilization because the flagellated sperm cell must swim through a film of water to reach the egg. So similar to Bryophytes, the protellus or the gametophyte have a structure known as archegonium and antheridium. So antheridium tu yang akan undergo mitosis to produce sperm. Archegonium will undergo mitosis to produce egg. So for the sperm to fertilize the egg, dia perlukan air. Next, the sporophyte generation is the dominant generation over the gametophyte generation. So ni tak sama dengan Bryophytes, iaitu dia terbalik. So kalau Bryophytes tadi, dominant generation adalah gametophyte. Tapi kalau dalam Pteridophytes, the dominant generation is Sporophyte. Maksudnya Sporophyte has larger size and longer lifespan compared to the gametophyte generation. Sporophyte generation does not depend or independent of the gametophyte generation for water and nutrients. So previously in the Bryophytes, the Sporophyte generation is dependent on the gametophyte. Tapi for Pteridophytes, the Sporophyte generation does not depend on the gametophyte, ataupun dia adalah independent of the gametophyte generation for water or nutrients. So the reason for this is, dekat sini kita nampak both the gametophyte, which is the protellus, and the mature sperm, the sporophyte, dua-dua warna hijau. Maksudnya, both of this generation are photosynthetic. Protellus tu boleh buat photosynthesis sendiri, so produce their own food, and they also have their own root-like structure, which is rhizoid. So dia boleh absorb water and minerals sendiri. So protellus are an independent organism. Dia boleh hidup sendiri without the help of the sporophyte, which is the mature sperm. So mature sperm pun sama. Mature sperm ada daun sendiri yang kita panggil sebagai frond. At the same time, dia ada true roots untuk absorb water and mineral. So sporophyte untuk pteridophyte, dia boleh buat makanan sendiri. That's why it is independent of the protellus, the gametophyte generation. So tak sama dengan Bryophytes tadi. Kalau Bryophytes tadi, gametophyte tu yang boleh buat photosynthesis dan absorb water and mineral. Dia punya sporophyte tak boleh. That's why sporophyte dia dependent. Tapi for Pteridophytes, both the gametophyte and the sporophyte generation are able to undergo photosynthesis and able to absorb their own water and mineral. So they are independent of each other. Special for pteridophytes is in terms of spore. So the spore produced in pteridophytes can be homosporous or heterosporous. Homo means same, hetero means different. For the homosporous spore, the spore will develop into a bisexual gametophyte. Maksudnya gametophyte itu will have both archegonium and enteridium. Tapi ada juga pteridophytes yang can produce two types of spore, iaitu heterosporous. So for the two types of spore, it can produce microspore dan juga megaspore. So microspore yang akan develop into male gametophyte, megaspore akan develop into female gametophyte. So ada dua gametophyte yang berbeza, male dan juga female. For example, kat sini kita nampak untuk fern iaitu Bryophytes. Bryophytes ni adalah jenis yang homosporous. So untuk Pteridophytes yang heterosporous adalah daripada spesies Lycopodium. So untuk Lycopodium kita akan nampak dekat dia punya structure akan ada microspore dan juga akan ada megaspore. So megaspore ni yang bersaiz besar, microspore tu yang kita nampak bintik-bintik kecil ni. So one type of plant kita akan jumpa dua-dua, megaspore dan juga microspore. So microspore akan produce male gametophyte, megaspore akan produce female gametophyte. So itu spesies lain, Lycopodium. Tapi untuk homosporous, itu yang awak kena ingat iaitu Bryophytes species.